All right, we're getting new details about a deadly shooting in Northeast Harris County. That is where a man killed his wife and injured an investigator. Tonight we are seeing and hearing how chaotic that scene was from a neighbor security camera video. KPRC2's Bill Barajas is live in that neighborhood tonight with those new details. Bill.
Well, we're learning more about that suspect and his wife. Harris County Sheriff investigators telling us the couple had recently struggled with domestic violence issues. Friends and neighbors saying that the suspect was a Navy recruiter and shared 6 children with his wife at this home here just behind me on Tulich. It's unclear what caused Thursday's shooting, but we were able to obtain video showing the moments the shooting started. This quiet Balmoral community was shaken by gunfire. You can clearly hear the first shot. Several more follow. Agents with the Naval Criminal Investigative Service can be seen approaching the home. Several more rounds go off. The suspect was caught on camera chasing down one of 2 NCIS agents and firing multiple shots, eventually hitting and injuring one. Both agents and a child at the home ran to Melissa Carrillo's house to take cover.
My instinct for was close my door, my garage door, with their inside with my kid, and they have another kid too. I was with the little kid when all the craziness.
Do you know
happened.
how old he was? Was he young?
I think 3 years old.
The suspect took off and was eventually tracked down and shot at the Stone Mist Apartments in Northwest Harris County. His wife found dead holding one of their children in her arms.
I never saw the guy or the mother. No, I never. It's new for me. I just moved like a couple weeks ago.
And again, the suspect and his wife have yet to be identified. Both children, including the one in his mother's arms and the one taken to Carrillo's home, were told were unharmed. The agent that was shot is expected to make a full recovery. We're live in Northeast Harris County. Bill Barajas, KPRC2 News.
Bill, thank you.
It's the kind of horror you can't unhear. She was holding her baby, and he still pulled the trigger. Those words don't come from a crime novelist or a scripted drama. They came from a trembling voice, a family member who still wakes in the middle of the night, replaying that sound. On September 22nd, 2022, in a quiet neighborhood northeast of Houston, a young mother's desperate cry for help ended in the very nightmare she feared most. She had invited federal agents into her home, believing their presence would finally keep her safe. But safety never came. In the next few minutes, you will hear about a moment so unthinkable, so devastating, that even seasoned investigators struggle to talk about it. It happened in front of trained law enforcement. It happened while she held her infant child. And it happened in the one place she should have been protected, her own home. Picture it, a modest house in Atascocita, Texas. Inside, the air is heavy. A mother sits with her baby in her arms, speaking quietly to 2 Naval Criminal Investigative Service agents about months of escalating abuse. Somewhere in the distance, a toddler plays in another room, blissfully unaware. Then the sound. The front door slams open. Heavy boots strike the floor. And before anyone can react, the shots begin. In seconds, 6 children were left without a mother. Moments later, they would have no father either. Before we go any further, if stories like this make your heart drop, subscribe now. One day, it could be your neighbor, your friend, or you. And if you think it couldn't, I want you to tell us in the comments why you believe you're safe. Because this is not just a story about violence. This is about the terrifying reality that even in the presence of authority, even when you do everything right, you can still be silenced forever. Why was Takara Glenn Hightower killed? And how could her killer walk into a room full of federal agents and still pull the trigger? Let's find out.
Welcome to Twisted Crimes Files, where the darkest truths come to light. Stay with us for chilling stories you won't forget, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss a case.
At the center of this case is Takara Glenn Hightower, 34 years old, a mother of 6 children whose ages span from barely a year old to the brink of their teenage years. To those who knew her, she was more than a parent. She was the anchor in a storm, the voice that settled arguments, the one who somehow made 6 different schedules work in perfect balance. Takara lived in Atascocita, an unincorporated community in northeast Harris County, Texas, a place often described in real estate listings as family-friendly, quiet, and ideal for raising children. But statistics tell a different story. In 2021, Harris County ranked among the highest in Texas for domestic violence-related fatalities, with dozens of women killed by intimate partners. It was a county where the threat didn't just lurk in dark alleys. It could walk right through your own front door. Neighbors remember the Hightower home as outwardly normal. The grass was trimmed, the front porch decorated seasonally. Kids' bikes leaned against the sidewall. From the outside, nothing suggested that behind those doors there had been repeated calls to law enforcement, or that the woman inside was searching for a way out. Takara's life had layers. She was a devoted mother who often appeared at school functions, even if it meant rushing from another commitment. She was a daughter and sister who stayed in constant contact with her family back in Illinois, sometimes calling them 2 or 3 times a day. She was also the wife of a U.S. Navy senior chief recruiter, Gregory L. Hightower, a man whose military career painted a picture of discipline, order, and national service, a sharp contrast to the private life he led at home. 2 days before her death, Takara reached out to the Harris County Sheriff's Office with a very specific question. How do I file a restraining order? It wasn't the first time she'd sought help. Back in July, deputies had come to the house for a domestic dispute. Both Takara and Greg accused the other of physical assault. No arrests were made. No one left in handcuffs. On September 22, 2022, that history would collide with a chain of decisions, some by her, some by the system meant to protect her, that set the stage for the final moments of her life. This is not just the story of a killing. It is the story of a mother who tried to be heard, and the question of why, even surrounded by the highest levels of authority, her voice wasn't enough to save her. If you're watching this thinking you'd step in and help, prove it. Subscribe so this story reaches more people who might save a life. And if you wouldn't, be honest and explain why in the comments. Before her name was on headlines, before the word victim was used to define her life, Takara Glenn was just key to the people who loved her. She was born in Illinois in the late 1980s, the second of 3 daughters to Chinitha Glenn, a woman known for her steady, no-nonsense love. The Glenn home was small but warm, the kind of place where Sunday dinners meant 3 generations gathered around a table, passing dishes until everyone's plate was full. From childhood, Takara stood out. She had that rare mix of boldness and compassion, a girl who would argue fiercely if she felt someone was being treated unfairly, but who would also give away her lunch to a classmate without hesitation. Friends from her elementary school still remember her laugh, big, unreserved, contagious. She was athletic in her teenage years, playing basketball for her high school team, but her real talent showed up in quieter ways. She had an eye for style, the kind that didn't come from following trends, but from making them. Even in group photos, you could spot her instantly, head tilted, eyes bright, wearing something she'd personalized just enough to make it her own. After graduating high school, she stayed close to her family, working jobs that allowed her flexibility. By her early 20s, she had become a mother, and from the moment she held her first child, her entire life shifted. Her friends say she didn't just love her children, she built her identity around them. Every decision she made, from where she lived to how she spent her weekends, was filtered through one question: is this good for my kids? Her life in Illinois eventually led her south, to Texas, a move sparked by a combination of opportunity and love. She was adventurous enough to take a leap into a new environment, but grounded enough to make sure her children were secure before she did. It was in Texas that she met Gregory Hightower, the man who would become her husband and later the father to several of her children. But before we go there, it's important to understand what anchored Takara. She wasn't just a mother. She was a planner, a protector, a builder of small joys. She kept her kids' school projects in label bins, saved receipts just in case, and found time to volunteer for PTA events even when life was hectic. On social media, she shared snapshots of birthday cakes she'd baked herself, Halloween costumes she'd sewn late into the night, and little videos of her kids dancing, in the living room. Her best friend, Christina Azel, described her as a fearless lioness and protective mama bear who lived for each of her children. Christina wasn't exaggerating. Takara's children, 6 in total, were the center of her world. Every scraped knee, every award, every bedtime story was a thread in the fabric of her life. The bond was mutual. To her kids, she wasn't just mom. She was comfort when the world felt scary, laughter when the day felt too long, and reassurance that no matter what happened, they would never face it alone. But what no one could have predicted was that the fierce love she had for her children would one day place her in the direct path of danger. Danger that would come not from a stranger, but from within her own home. Abuse can hide behind the happiest photos. If you believe awareness can stop it, subscribe now, or explain in the comments why you think keeping quiet is safer. By the time Takara had settled into life in Texas, she was in her late 20s, a woman who had weathered enough life to know what she wanted and what she didn't. It was around this time that she met Gregory L. Hightower. Greg was older, confident, and carried himself with the quiet authority of a man used to being in command. As a U.S. Navy senior chief recruiter, he was polished, the kind of man who could walk into a room in uniform and draw everyone's attention without saying a word. His words were deliberate, his posture perfect. For someone like Takara, who valued stability and structure, Greg seemed like a safe harbor. Their first interactions were almost cinematic in themselves. Friends recall seeing them together in those early weeks, laughing easily, sitting close at gatherings, her eyes locked on him when he spoke. Takara, with her warm, disarming smile, and Greg, with his composed and almost guarded demeanor, looked like opposites that made sense together. But what the outside world didn't see was how quickly their connection deepened. Greg wasn't just attentive, he was persistent. He learned her routines, remembered details about her children, and positioned himself as someone she could lean on. When she talked about the challenges of raising a large family, he didn't flinch. He leaned in, telling her he admired her strength. They married not long after, folding their lives into one. The wedding wasn't extravagant, but it was heartfelt. Photos from that day show Takara in a fitted white gown, her hair styled simply, holding a bouquet of ivory roses. Greg stood beside her in a crisp suit, his hand resting protectively at the small of her back. In those images, there are no shadows, only the brightness of a couple ready to build something together. Their early years were, at least in public, filled with the hallmarks of a growing family. Trips to the park with the children. Family dinners where Greg grilled outside, while Takara managed the chaos inside. Holiday photos with matching outfits, the kids lined up in order of height. But within that picture-perfect frame, small cracks began to show. It started subtly. Greg had opinions about who Takara spent time with. He preferred she limit her outings when he wasn't around. At first, it was framed as care, I just want to make sure you're safe, but over time it began to sound more like control. Friends noticed she was harder to reach. Invitations to outings were often met with polite declines. Christina, her best friend, remembers thinking that Greg seemed protective to the point of isolation. Still, Takara would defend him. He's just looking out for me, she'd say. He's seen things in his line of work. Life with Greg also meant living under the rules of his career. As a recruiter, he was respected in the community and known by many young men and women hoping to join the Navy. That reputation mattered to him, and any tension at home, he insisted, was to remain behind closed doors. For a while, Takara complied. She smiled for photos, posted loving tributes on birthdays, and praised him publicly as a provider and father. But those closest to her noticed the tone of her private conversations changing. Her calls to her family back in Illinois sometimes carried a heaviness she tried to mask. She'd talk about the kids, about errands, but occasionally her voice would dip and she'd let something slip. A disagreement that had gone too far, an argument that had left her shaken. The shift became undeniable in the summer of 2022. In July, deputies were called to their home for a domestic disturbance. Both Takara and Greg accused the other of hitting them. Neither was arrested. For outsiders, It might have seemed like a heated argument that got out of hand, the kind that could be resolved. But for Takara's family, it was a warning sign, one that left them uneasy. And yet, by the next public photo, they looked like they had found their balance again, smiling together at a community event, his arm around her shoulders. The truth was far more complicated. What no one outside their walls could fully see was the cycle. Moments of tenderness, followed by tension, followed by reconciliation that never quite erased the unease. It's important to understand this part of Takara's life, because it's here, in the quiet accumulation of control, in the normalization of conflict, that the foundation for what happened later was laid. Abuse can hide behind the happiest photos. The morning of Thursday, September 22nd, 2022, began like any other in the Hightower household. The air was warm, typical for late September in southeast Texas, and sunlight was spilling through the slats of the blinds in the living room. Outside, you could hear the faint hum of early commuters on Atascocita Road, the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog, and the low, rhythmic whir of an air conditioning unit working against the heat. Inside, the house was alive with the sound of children. Two of the older kids were already dressed for school, fussing over backpacks and lunch bags on the kitchen counter. In the corner, the baby, just over a year old, sat in a high chair, reaching for the bright orange sippy cup Takara had placed in front of her. A toddler waddled in and out of the hallway, clinging to a worn stuffed animal. Takara moved through the chaos with the kind of practiced efficiency only a mother of 6 could master. She wore leggings and a loose t-shirt, her hair tied back, no makeup, the kind of comfortable attire meant for a day at home, but her phone stayed close by on the counter. Every few minutes, she would glance at it, tapping out quick replies between packing snacks and adjusting shoelaces. Her mind wasn't on grocery lists or laundry that morning. 2 days earlier, she had called the Harris County Sheriff's Office asking how to file a restraining order. The answers she'd received hadn't been quick or simple, but it led to an important next step, a meeting with agents from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. By late morning, the older children had been dropped off at school, leaving the toddler and the baby at home with her. Takara straightened the living room, stacking small toys into a plastic bin, wiping crumbs from the coffee table. Not out of vanity, but out of a quiet need to keep order in the middle of a life that often felt anything but. Shortly after 1 p.m., a dark sedan pulled into the driveway. 2 NCIS agents stepped out. One male, one female, both in plain clothes but with badges clipped visibly at their waists. They carried notepads and wore the focused expressions of people who had heard variations of this story before but knew every case was its own storm. Takara welcomed them inside. She settled onto the couch with the baby on her lap, the toddler playing quietly on the rug nearby. The agents positioned themselves across from her, one sitting in the armchair, the other standing slightly to the side, pen poised. They began with routine questions. Her full name, date of birth, length of marriage. Her voice was steady at first. She described incidents in measured detail. Not too emotional, as if she'd rehearsed this to make sure it came out clearly. She told them about arguments that had escalated, about the July incident when deputies were called, about the way Greg's temper had shifted in recent months. As the questions went on, her tone changed. She leaned forward slightly, eyes flicking toward the front door more often than before. She admitted she was afraid of what might happen if Greg learned she'd spoken to NCIS. The agents took notes, occasionally asking her to clarify details. The baby squirmed in her lap. She bounced her gently, never breaking eye contact with the agent speaking to her. Outside, a car engine turned over somewhere down the street, a normal neighborhood sound, easily ignored. Then another sound, the crunch of tires on the gravel edge of her driveway. The quick, sharp thud of a car door slamming. Takara's shoulders stiffened. She glanced toward the window, but said nothing. One of the agents noticed and followed her gaze. In the seconds that followed, events moved too fast for anyone to stop them. The front door swung inward with a force that rattled the picture frames on the wall. Gregory Hightower stepped inside. No knock, no hesitation. He wasn't in uniform. He wore dark jeans, a fitted shirt, and on his face was something more chilling than anger, it was resolve. His right hand gripped a handgun, the metal catching the afternoon light streaming through the window. The air in the living room changed instantly. The toddler froze mid-play, clutching the stuffed animal to his chest. The baby in Takara's arms began to whimper, sensing her mother's sudden shift in energy. Takara's voice caught in her throat. She didn't scream, but her eyes widened, a silent alarm. One of the NCIS agents rose from the armchair, their hand instinctively moving toward their sidearm. The other agent taking a half step forward, placing themselves between Greg and Takara. Greg's gaze locked on his wife. No words, no acquiescence, just a fixed, unwavering glare that made the room feel smaller by the second. The first shot tore through the silence like glass shattering in an empty hallway. The baby's cry turned into a sharp wail. Takara jerked from the impact, her grip tightening protectively around her child. The agents shouted urgent, overlapping commands. One moved to push Takara toward the hallway, the other reaching for their weapon. But Greg's pace didn't falter. He fired again, the muzzle flashed bright in the dim space between them. The smell of gunpowder filled the air, acrid and heavy. The toddler screamed, scrambling toward the far corner of the room. One agent managed to draw and fire back, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. Greg flinched but didn't go down. Instead, he pivoted toward the doorway, as if he'd already planned his exit. Takara collapsed sideways onto the couch, her arms instinctively curling around the baby even as her strength gave way. The child's cries pierced through the chaos, a desperate sound that cut deeper than any gunshot. The agents moved fast, one rushing to check Takara, the other shouting into their radio, calling for backup, describing the suspect and the direction of flight. Outside, tires screeched against asphalt as Greg's vehicle tore down the street. Within moments, the living room became a crime scene. A child's toy lay overturned in the middle of the rug. A half-empty bottle sat on the coffee table, its contents spilling onto the floor. The toddler was scooped up by one of the agents, carried into the safety of a back room, his small hands gripping the fabric of the agent's shirt. Takara was unresponsive. Her breathing had already stopped. The agent kneeling beside her pressed 2 fingers to her neck, then glanced toward their partner. A silent acknowledgement of the worst possible outcome. They covered the baby with a blanket, not to hide her, but to shield her from the sight she would never understand. In less than 90 seconds, the conversation Takara had been having about her safety had turned into the moment that ended her life. Gregory Hightower's vehicle roared away from the neighborhood, the low growl of the engine swallowed by the sprawl of Atascocita's mid-afternoon traffic. The NCIS agents inside the home relayed his description over the radio. A dark-colored sedan, last seen heading west, armed and dangerous. Harris County Dispatch immediately activated what's known as a hot pursuit coordination, patching NCIS, the Sheriff's Office, and Houston Police into a shared channel. Every officer listening now had a mental picture of Greg, a seasoned military recruiter trained in discipline, marksmanship, and evasion. 2 p.m., deputies and patrol units began fanning out along possible escape routes. While Clayton Parkway, FM 1960, and the feeder roads leading toward Interstate 69. Traffic cameras were pinged for his license plate number. Greg, however, seemed to be working for his own plan. Witnesses later reported seeing his sedan cutting through residential streets, avoiding major intersections, making a series of deliberate turns that suggested he knew exactly where he was going. By 2:18 p.m., his car appeared on surveillance footage from a gas station near the North Belt. He didn't stop for fuel. He didn't even slow down. But that footage confirmed his direction, northwest Houston. Investigators later pieced together that Greg was heading toward the apartment of a relative, a location outside of Atascocita where he might have believed he could regroup, hide, or negotiate some kind of surrender. But law enforcement wasn't giving him that chance. By 2:40 p.m., unmarked sheriff's units had set up in the vicinity of the apartment complex. SWAT officers were notified. Helicopter support was requested. When Greg arrived, he parked not in front of the building, but several rows back, as if to obscure his car from street view. Deputies moving quickly, but Greg was already stepping out, weapon in hand. The confrontation was fast and violent. Deputies shouted commands, "Drop the weapon, get on the ground." But Greg didn't comply. Witnesses heard the first exchange of gunfire echo between the apartment buildings. Several rounds struck parked cars, shattering windows. Greg fired back, taking cover briefly behind a concrete pillar, then moving toward stairwell. It didn't matter. Within moments, deputies returned fire, striking him multiple times. He collapsed near the base of the stairwell, weapons still close to his right hand. 2:52 p.m., Greg was pronounced dead at the scene. With the suspect down, attention turned to evidence gathering. The handgun recovered from Greg was matched to the caliber used in Takara's killing. His car contained extra magazines, personal documents, and, perhaps most telling, his Navy-issued identification, suggesting he had no intention of running far without it. From here, investigators began mapping out theories about his motive. 1. Silencing a witness. Takara's cooperation with NCIS threatened to trigger not only legal charges, but career-ending military consequences for Greg. Eliminating her would eliminate the testimony. 2. Control and possession. Greg had shown signs of a controlling nature during the marriage. The thought of her breaking free, legally or emotionally, could have been intolerable to him. 3. Escalation pattern. The July domestic disturbance and her recent inquiry about a restraining order suggest a cycle of rising tension. In many domestic violence cases, the most dangerous time for a victim is when they try to leave. Yet the most haunting question for investigators was not why Greg acted, but how. How could a man under active investigation for abuse, sitting across from 2 federal agents, walk into that home with a loaded weapon and kill his wife before anyone could stop him? That question would ripple through the halls of NCIS, the sheriff's office, and eventually a federal courtroom. Domestic violence escalates fast. Sometimes there's no second chance to help. Subscribe now so more people see this warning. If you wouldn't share it, at least say why below. Maybe your reason will save someone. News of Greg's death didn't bring relief to Takara's family. It didn't feel like justice. It felt like the closing of a door, slamming shut on any chance to ever hear her side of the story in her own words. When the phone rang in Illinois that afternoon, Takara Glenn, Takara's mother, was in her kitchen preparing dinner. She remembered the sound of the voice on the other end, firm, clipped, official, and how her knees buckled before the details even came. Her daughter was gone. By the time Chinitha arrived in Texas, the home where Takara had taken her last breath was already taped off and quiet. The front porch, where her grandchildren sometimes played, now looked like the front row to a nightmare. Inside, the silence was different from any silence she'd known before. It was the silence of 6 children waiting for answers that would never make sense. The youngest, the baby who had been in Takara's arms, was too small to understand. But the older ones, they asked questions. Questions no child should have to form. Why did Daddy hurt Mommy? Who will tuck us in now? Is Mommy coming back? Chinitha answered each one with as much grace as she could, but the truth sat heavy in the air. Their mother's voice would never echo through these rooms again. In the days that followed, the house became a gathering place. Friends, neighbors, and extended family came with trays of food, bouquets of flowers, and faces marked by disbelief. Christina Azel, Takara's best friend, was among the first to step in. Christina remembered the woman who had been her constant since their teenage years. The girl who would show up unannounced with snacks and music, the woman who would laugh until tears streamed down her face, the mother who seemed to juggle 100 things without ever letting the ball drop. She described Takara as a fearless lioness and protective mama bear who lived for each of her children. The bond she shared with them was like none other. The selfless, caring, and relentless woman that she was shined bright in her children's eyes. Christina started a GoFundMe, writing each sentence through tears. She wasn't just asking for donations to cover the funeral. She was asking the world to see Takara as more than a headline. She wanted people to know about the bedtime stories, the silly dances in the kitchen, the way Takara never forgot a birthday or a school project. On the night of the vigil, the community gathered in front of the Hightower home. Candles flickered in paper cups, casting warm halos on the faces of those who stood shoulder to shoulder. Some held photographs, others clutched stuffed animals to pass along to the children. A small speaker played one of Takara's favorite songs, the melody drifting into the September air. One by one, people stepped forward to speak. A cousin recalled childhood summers together, chasing fireflies until their mothers called them in. A neighbor remembered how Takara would wave every time she drove past, no matter how rushed she was. And Chinitha, she stood with her voice trembling, telling the crowd that her daughter had been a fighter, but even fighters need protection. By the end of the vigil, the flames of the candles seemed to burn brighter, not because they could undo what had been done, but because they were the only light the community could offer in the dark that Greg had left behind. In the weeks following the vigil, grief began to transform into something else: determination. Takara's death had left an ache in the community, but it had also ignited a fire in those who loved her. The question everyone was asking was simple but sharp. How could this happen with federal agents in the room? Domestic violence advocates stepped forward. They spoke at community meetings, held panels at local churches, and called for stronger protocols within law enforcement and the military. Survivors of abuse, some who had never told their stories before, began to share their own experiences of reaching out for help and still feeling unprotected. In Harris County, the case became a talking point for policy reform. State and local leaders called for reviews of how NCIS handles domestic abuse allegations involving service members. Why weren't weapons removed from Greg's possession? Why wasn't a protective perimeter established during the interview? These questions weren't just being whispered in private. They were being demanded publicly, loudly. But while the public conversation gained momentum, the private battle for Takara's children had already begun. Her mother, Takara Glenn, uprooted her life in Illinois and moved to Texas to care for the 5 youngest, while the oldest tried to adjust to life in college without the daily voice of her mom cheering her on. Bills piled up. The emotional strain deepened. Yet Chinitha was unwavering. She would keep her family together. By early 2025, the family's grief had taken on a legal form. With the help of attorney Lori Higginbotham, they filed a federal wrongful death lawsuit against the United States Navy. The claim was straightforward but devastating. The Navy had failed to protect Takara despite clear warnings and her active cooperation in an investigation. The lawsuit alleged that the Navy knew Greg was under domestic violence investigation. They knew Takara feared for her life. They failed to confiscate his firearms. They did not provide her with adequate protection, even during the NCIS interview. The family wasn't just seeking money, though the suit did list $30 million per plaintiff. They were seeking accountability. They wanted systemic change, so no other family would have to sit in a courtroom holding a photo of someone the system could have saved. But in July 2025, the Navy formally rejected responsibility. In their response, they denied negligence and refused the family's financial demand. The decision landed like another blow, reopening wounds that had barely begun to close. For the Glenn family, the fight was far from over. They vowed to keep pushing, even if it meant years in court. The case also became a cautionary tale in domestic violence education programs. It underscored the truth advocates have been repeating for years. The most dangerous moment for a victim is when they decide to leave or speak out. Takara's story was now being used to train both civilians and law enforcement officers. Her name a reminder of the stakes when action is too slow or too cautious.